Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time this afternoon, I'm excited to welcome you all to the virtual symposium, Care Work, Space, Bodies, and the Politics of Care here at Rice Architecture. My name is Brittany Utting, and I'm Assistant Professor of Architecture here at Rice, and I wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Since some of you may have missed the first panel, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the symposium. So please bear with me if you've heard some of the words before, and then I'll follow up with an introduction of the panelists joining us this afternoon. All right, so as both an inevitable starting point and a looming background, COVID-19 has forcefully demonstrated the physicality of our collective body. Health is communal, bodies are political, and care work is essential. Our current moment represents not only a crisis in health, but reflects a profound dismantling of the structures of support essential to the maintenance of life. Today, however, care has reemerged as a space in which gender, race, and class are intimately reshaping the relationships between our bodies and their environments. This recentering of care as the most essential workforce, from health work to ecological maintenance to domestic labor, demands a critical reassessment of how we shoulder the burdens of production and reproduction together. Through an interrogation of two scales of care, the infrastructural and the embodied, the symposium will examine architecture's capacity to support the labors of care. So while architectures of health quickly conjure images of sanatoria, hospitals, or quarantine housing, architectures of care could be understood as more deeply inscribed in the everyday habits, banal spaces, and background surfaces of our lives. In our first panel, we heard Maria Giudici speak about typological experiments in building solidarity, from housing to footpaths to gardens. We heard Torsten Lang speak about queer communities and their infrastructures of care and support during the AIDS epidemic. Sarah Nichols spoke about the maintenance of concrete and the reciprocity between fragility and care. And Rosario Talevi spoke about pedagogical experiments in climate care, commenting and inhabiting the landscape of the floating university in Berlin. So in the second half of the day, in the second panel, we will continue to interrogate architecture's relationship to care work as an intimate alliance between the built environment and the embedded material, social, and labor practices. Ultimately, we want to use this moment to take stock of these critical infrastructures and ask, how can we unearth and cultivate new forms of care? So before we get started, a quick note on the webinar format. For those of you watching the lecture, please feel free to ask a question by typing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Student Representative Caleb Yen will read them out loud for the lecture for the panelists and the audience to hear. All right, so this afternoon panel, Embodiments of Care, will examine architectures of care through the lens of the body and its political, material, and affective conditions. Panelists include Gia Yi Gu, Home Office, F Architecture, and Fabiola López-Durán, who you can see on the screen. Everyone. All right, so our first panelist, is Gia Yi Gu. Gia is an architectural historian, educator, and curator who works on, thinks about, and occasionally writes about minor institutional spaces, ethics of care, and media-based practices in architecture. She is currently director of Mack Center for Art and Architecture. From 2015 to 2020, she served as executive director of Materials and Applications, a Los Angeles-based project space for experimental architecture. In 2016, she co-founded the architecture research and design studio Spinagu with Maxi Spina. She is currently a Ph.D. candidate in architectural history at UCLA and is a visiting fellow in architecture at the California College of Art. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Gia. Thank you all again and welcome.
So hello, thank you for the introduction, and thank you Brittany Utting and Rice University for this invitation to join this really wonderful panel on a very timely topic. So as Brittany's mentioned, I'm the newly appointed director of Mack Center for Art and Architecture here in LA. I joined the organization in January, and today I'll be talking a little bit about my work between organizations and institutions in architecture. Specifically, this idea of an institution as a very concrete, bureaucratic, slow-moving, yet powerful machine, and its capacity for ideas and propositions, which often can seem very abstract, ephemeral, intangible, but are just as powerful, and just yet equally powerful thing in the world. Some of the work will be centered on the things I'm thinking about at Mack Center, but some of the work I'll be sharing will also be tied to my previous organization, Materials and Applications, which currently is headed by the director, Keichu. So what I'll be sharing is just my time between both worlds in a way. I won't talk so much about the projects that have come out of each institution, but instead I want to focus a little bit on the work that I'm doing inside it. A kind of invisible work that doesn't really carry a project title, but I hope will prompt some reflection about the state of architectural institutions more generally, and a critical look at the state of our cultural production. I titled this talk, "The Institution as a Proposition," borrowed from David Josselit text Size Matters, in which he argues sort of brilliantly about the need for small arts and well, he talks about small art spaces, but a lot of these ideas migrate also to thinking about what are the kinds of minor spaces for architectural cultural production. As it turns out, with someone with all these titles and affiliations that I have, I'm always working within an institution, whether in a research university, a private art college, or a nonprofit art and architecture space. This means I think a lot about what institutions are, how they work, how to work within them, and how to reflect my own work and thinking as an institutional subject within these systems. I should say this presentation's a kind of 1 out of 3 series of talks I've already given to the University of Toronto and California College of Art, but of course modified a little bit to address my most recent thinking. And I really appreciate this opportunity to sort of as a way of reflecting. So I mentioned that I'm kind of straddling between 2 institutions. I recently left one that I deeply love on the left-hand side, Materials and Applications, and I joined another one that I'm just getting to know, Mack Center for Art and Architecture. And upon first glance, they're completely different institutions. One is small, its budget size under $100,000. The other is a much larger organization, much larger budget, but in some ways very similar. So I should say Mack Center for Art and Architecture, if you don't know it and you ever visit Los Angeles, you should come join us there whenever you can. Mack Center essentially stewards 3 significant modernist masterpieces by Austrian architect R.M. Schindler and activates them with contemporary art and architecture. Whereas looking at Materials and Applications, an organization that's so small that it kind of exists within indeterminate spaces. What often happens at M&A is it takes over underutilized spaces and transforms them through installations. But a central question that connects all of my work between all of these different organizations is that I like to think deeply about institutional structures, and I like to think deeply about the relationships that get constructed when we do institutional work. So I'll begin this question not by asking what is the institution, but by asking what is the self when it encounters the institutions. And often I'm thinking a lot about the kinds of institutional subjects that get produced when we all participate in the systems and structures that govern our work. So again, my presentation is not really about what I would call my projects or my work, but it's a constellation of ideas and thoughts that have become foundational to all the work that I do, whether it's in scholarship or design, or in this case, institution building. And I'm really right now trying to surface these ideas through language and through the formalities of this public talk. I'm really interested in institution building, how current institutions exist, but how much more expansively we can re-envision their existence and how they might undergo such transformations. Some of this takes place in really small working groups. So I'm in a really wonderful, I think a few members of this group are here right now, but I'm in a really wonderful working group with emerging scholars thinking about how we can co-learn anti-racist practices in architectural history. I'm also, sort of a smaller contributor, but excited contributor to another initiative, Dark Matter University, which is much more public and provocative. It's essentially an organizing network led by emerging BIPOC educators in architecture, design, and urban planning. So if you're not aware of Dark Matter, I encourage you to check them out. So I think about institutional work across all sites of architecture in practice in Spinagu, but also in the academy where I teach, and in the many forms of public institutions that I often find myself in. This question of thinking about the self in the institution and thinking about how the personal emerges within the professional is, deeply indebted to the intellectual and political work that Black feminist scholars and activists have been engaged with for decades. So it's not new, but specifically thinkers like Bell Hooks, who has always interpolated her critical thoughts within her own personhood and subjectivity. Audre Lorde, who was never shy to remind us that there is a purpose and use to our emotions, particularly the emotion of anger, and Octavia Butler, who spent her lifetime spinning language into propositions. It's also, my thinking is also deeply indebted to many of my friends, including Rosario Televi, who's here with us. I can't name them all, but I just want to recognize that this work isn't being done alone. Turning the lens back onto ourselves as subjects being produced by the context and environments around us, by the systems that produce us as practitioners, is a way of asking us how to think about the modes by which the personal and the professional collide. Institutions are generally really good at making labor invisible. And so in some of my work, I've been thinking about how to make certain forms of labor more visible, how to clarify that labor, and how to communicate the work. And it takes very unexciting forms like flowcharts and spreadsheets, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. As the director of Max Center, most of my work is extremely bureaucratic and administrative, which often people assume to be non-conceptual. And I actually think it's extremely the opposite. I think that my tolerance for bureaucracy, procedures, financial statements, reporting, and timelines are made possible because within all of these sites, I can conceptualize the purpose and meaning of the activities within a larger framework. So I often think of administration as a means of struggle towards comprehension, thinking about what it means to build an institution that's legible on the front end as much as it is on the back end. And my work as a director is to ask what are the appropriate institutional frameworks by which specific ideas can achieve legibility? What are the ways in which we can make new work, explore new processes, and think new thoughts? One of the actions we've taken at Max Center in the past 2 months, which was migrated from something we were also doing at Materials and Applications, is to take some of the work we do and make them more visible. So one of the processes we recently engaged with, which is still ongoing and unfinished, is the collective production of an organizational flowchart, documenting, adjusting, and reinventing some of the procedures that make up 90% of our institutional work. So essentially every week we dedicate a few hours collectively as a team to sit down together and identify the actions taken in the organization and begin to map out how actions connect to one another, how one person's work feeds into a larger process. And this helps us understand not only the value of each person's work, whether administrative or creative or manual, whether there's differences between that, but most importantly, make certain forms of tacit knowledge more explicit and make certain forms of invisible labor more visible. It's, to quote Melissa Lowe, a historian of science, it's a means of processing our process. And I like to migrate back and forth between things like that are extremely boring, like flowcharts and spreadsheets, to things that are very ambitious, like institutions, because I tend to think of these as sites where the embodiment of care are most important and that we should attend to most deeply. The strategy of flowcharting our labor, let's say, is a strategy that's borrowed from the Feminist Organization's Handbook, a publication put forward by the Women's Center for Creative Work based here in Los Angeles. The self-published volume is an explorable model of their organization. It articulates their thoughts, administrative protocols, and their ways of working in order to benefit others trying to do the same work. And I like to just also remember and remind everyone that while I'm talking about flowcharts and diagrams, there's also this need to understand diagrams as themselves, not the end of the work. So Melissa Lowe, in the essay within this particular handbook, she writes about the arts of the actionable diagram. And she writes that it's helpful to remember that not all diagrams give people good reasons for doing what they tell you to do. Indeed, one of the greatest challenges of being a person is the attempt to move from paper worlds to bodies to communities and back again. Additionally, some diagrams operate on the presumption that abstraction is best, therefore holding feelings at a distance. So in all of my work, I'm really struck by this idea that Melissa is presenting, how one moves from the paper document to the body, from the body back to the institution, and from personhood to profession. Are these always dichotomous to one another, or can we find opportunities in which they collapse and in which they inform one another? So in thinking about some of the ways one can structure a public institution dedicated to architecture and art, I've been thinking a lot from other sites of organizing, let's say. Not many of us have the opportunity to think about how one could build a system and structure and have a certain authority to enact it. So even in my role, I don't have total authority, negotiating between many types of actors and participants in my organization that precede me, or bodies whose authorities exceed my own. To quote Dean Spade, an activist and scholar, most of us have never been in a group that had fair, participatory, transparent structures. So I tend to agree that we actually have a kind of inadequacy of knowledge of how we can organize together. And I would say, especially in architecture, that, despite the fact that the architectural profession has long understood itself as a kind of service-based practice, providing for society's most basic needs like shelter and community, in our practices, the architect's work is often structured by extreme forms of hierarchy and profit, filtered through contracts and laws. We've really failed, I think, to erect some of the most basic systems of care in our own professional work. And instead, we've really invested in harmful systems, including excessive student debt, transactional service models, an exploitative labor condition, and an extractive economy that's dedicated to clients holding the highest capital. Thinking about these conditions in the fall of 2020, alongside Materials and Applications Program Board, including Aubrey Bauer, Matthias Comparato, Gary Richero-Fox, Jesse Hammer, Alyssa Lopez, Kendall Mann, Dana McKinney, and Sage Roebuck, we organized a conversation with Dean Spade on his forthcoming book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. And what we were trying to do was think about the ways in which principles of mutual aid, which include identifying harmful systems, modeling alternatives, modeling alternatives and intervening in specific sites within the system, how these principles of mutual aid could be migrated into the logic of professional practice itself. Often these networks focus on immediate forms of care rather than categorical solutions. And a huge part of this conversation is to really think about how we can engage with notions of care over notions of transaction. I'm just going to close quickly on another program I co-organized at Materials and Applications in fall 2020. You can see there was a theme and some of the things that we were doing and thinking about. This panel was called Organizing as Architectural Labor, which brought together 4 architectural coalitions: Architecture Lobby, Another Possible Imaginary, Dark Matter University, and New Architecture Writers to address organizing as an invisible form of labor in architecture. So we were joined by Kilian Riano from Architecture Lobby, Jonathan Chrisman from API, Thomas Aquilina from New Architecture Writers, and Mira Henry and A.L. Hugh from Dark Matter University. Each of these speakers shared a contemporary practice that emergent architects were undertaking to address systemic racism in architecture. But the conversation looked very closely at certain skills of organizing, group building, and caretaking in a long-term manner. So really thinking about how we build new social and political infrastructures and how we model new systems of care for architectural practice across all sites, including cultural, pedagogy, and professional. One of the things I really liked the most about this was that we were looking closely not only at organizing as labor, but at the specific tools and assets that guide organizational work. So again, thinking about where spreadsheets, mural walls, Airtable, Google Forms, Google Doc emerge, and how these digital practices inform some of the ways in which we relate to one another and engage with one another. So this attention to the minor spaces of institutional work is what I'm most excited to talk about. Can attention to the details of practices like formatting, naming, spreadsheeting also address larger questions tied to politics, agency, and authorship? Can we understand spreadsheets? And let's say in the case of the open letters that have recently emerged, can these be determining structures that carry efficacy and redistribute power? One of the intentions of this panel, but in some of the recent writing that I'm doing, is to think about how to surface small scale interactions, habits, and very invisible formats of engagement, and how to pay attention to these details in small units that constitute our practices. I should also mention one of the things that that's going to come out soon is a short essay on spreadsheets and open letters that that's a conversation between myself, Lida Aguirre, Cyrus Penarroyo, and Gary Fox, thinking about the uses of spreadsheets and open letters as forms of digital vigilantism. And this will be published by Mass Context with a wonderful group of contributors. So I'm going to close out today with a little bit of a prompt. I shared with everyone a certain perspective I have about institutions, how small scale practices can map onto value systems that might help us rethink the ways in which we labor and the ways in which we work within certain spaces. And I'm very interested in things like the actionable diagram or the use of spreadsheets. But I will end with a larger prompt, which is to invite all of us to rethink the institutions that exist around us, to advocate and support for more public institutions in architecture. Just to, I don't know how many people think about this, but in architecture, cultural activity is often a very private, independent initiative. So to remind you, the Storefront for Art and Architecture began as a small artist-run space. The Canadian Centre for Architecture was never small, but it required the private wealth of Phyllis Lambert in order to become the institution that it is. There are almost no public civic will to build a public culture of architecture. Most architecture spaces and organizations are very grassroots and are often operating on volunteer or part-time labor. The problem of this landscape is that we don't have much capacity. We don't have the capital funding for growth. We have to maintain and remain a certain size and level of visibility. I think we're lacking especially if you look at things like the art world, we're lacking some basic systems by which to translate architecture into a form of public knowledge, one that's not premised on professionalization, but on general education. I think we all know this, but the threshold of entry for architecture to participate as a form of public culture is just too high in tuition cost, too high in capital investment, high in its hierarchies, and not to be, but extremely alienating in its overdependence on a specific Northeast intellectual corridor. So in this way, despite the fact that architecture itself is a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to building, we're an extremely impoverished field when it comes to the building of our institutional and non-institutional spaces. Another example would be in Los Angeles, we have dozens of museums dedicated to art, but only one dedicated to architecture, which is actually now not even a physical museum. And we have no single curatorial department in any major museum, governmental, private, to do the translational work around architectural culture. That means we have no body translating and challenging the work that architects are doing to a public audience. I don't think the solution is to open more venues, but to ask what are the new institutional frameworks that can and should exist in support of contemporary architecture. What if we take this idea of cultural institutions quite seriously, not just as a space where architects make presentations for their buildings and ideas, but as itself a practice that bears interrogation, critique, self-reflection, and self-awareness? What if we consider curation not to be the practice of selecting architectural work to show, but for caring as well, as a dialogue and conversation about architecture in an expanded and expansive public field? I think very seriously about what it means for architects to practice outside of a neoliberal or commercialized or corporatized context. And I think especially as somebody who graduated in 2014 from my Master's of Architecture program, the capacity to be a small independent practice is an extremely privileged and almost impossible opportunity. So how can we enable architects to work outside of these specific corporatized models of production? It doesn't mean asking the architect to be an artist, which is a position I want us to turn away from, because we can't be guileless about the influence of economies that also govern artistic work. So often what, the radical proposition is that, don't be an architect, go be an artist. Instead, I'd like us to think more seriously about building structures of cultural production and what that enables or closes down. And I also want to end on a quote by Donna Haraway, bringing us back to this relationship between institutions and ideas. There are stakes to how we think and what we know. There are limits to our knowledge, but there's also opportunities to broaden what we think. How we think is tied to the next thing and that we do think. And it's a chain of thoughts that always requires the first thought. And how we think of is, of course, also tied to how we do. I think we have to also be, committed to change our educational systems as well. We'll have a problem if our education and pedagogical systems don't align with the ongoing development of critical, historical, and curatorial thinking. And in this space right now, we have future practitioners. So maybe this last point is really directed at them or at you. You are the seeds of change, but you have to learn and you have to unlearn how to recognize what kind of change to ask for and what kind of change has already occurred and has been tested. So as Donna Haraway writes, it matters what thoughts think thoughts, it matters what knowledge is no knowledge. It matters what relations relate relations, and it matters what worlds worlds. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Gia, for that amazing institutional proposition. All right, so next, we have Home Office, a research and design collaborative founded by myself and my partner, Daniel Jacobs, also known as DJ. Our work centers around the spatial, social, and ecological arrangements of collective life. I'm an assistant professor here at Rice, and DJ is a visiting critic at the Gerald D. Hines College of Architecture and Design at the University of Houston, and also the secretary of the National Organizing Committee of the Architecture Lobby. So with that, let's take it away.
All right. Hello. Can everyone hear me? We good? Great. And the screen is shared. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining this afternoon, and thanks for the presenters who have illuminated such really interesting and incredible territories about care. Before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank the Rice University School of Architecture for their ongoing support. And perhaps most importantly, we'd especially like to thank our research assistant, Jianying Cui, who has been working with us for the past 2 years. So what we're going to talk about today is a brief history of the houseplant, examining the trends of cultivating tropical plants in our domestic interiors and the relationship to global systems of extraction and exchange and their attendant forms of labor and care. As a dubious origin for this project, we would like to begin with the impossible bouquet, a typology of 18th century Dutch still life painting. The painting type is characterized by abundant arrangements of botanical specimens, including flowers, fruits, insects that could never bloom, fruit, or exist simultaneously in nature due to the separations of climate and geography. These synthetic constructs were made possible by the advent of global markets in the Dutch Golden Age, which expanded colonial botanical and horticultural trades. As colonial empires accrued wealth and territorial holdings in the 18th and 19th centuries, they built botanical spaces to house specimens collected in colonized lands, carefully transported in Wardian case terrariums on their long journeys overseas. These collections emerged alongside new architectural forms and types for both cultivation and display, made possible by emerging material technologies like iron and glass, and mobilized by the wealth of colonial capitalism. Examples like the Palm House at London's Kew Gardens from 1844, pictured here in the background, were public vivariums that served to exhibit the living products of imperial accumulation, with plants as a proxy for colonial power. Such representations triggered intense consumer desire, leading to phenomena such as orchid delirium and pteridomania, or fern fever, in Victorian England.
At the same time, these technologies entered the space of the home. Bay windows, sun porches, and hothouses brought more sunlight into domestic space, enabling the indoor cultivation of imported tropical plants. Likewise, the profusion of foliage in the domestic interior also reflected Victorian culture's insatiable desire for exotic products and affects. In this photo, the languid posture of the woman lounging in her parlor channels the image of the odalisque, reflecting the era's colonial gaze. From the woman's pose to her tropical scenography to the majestic palms depicted in the room's wallpaper, these interiors transformed their inhabitants into colonists, explorers, naturalists, and collectors. As the British horticulturalist and garden designer Gertrude Jekyll writes in her 1890 book titled Home and Garden, quote, "There comes a point when the room becomes overloaded with flowers and greenery. During the last few years, I've seen many a drawing room where it appeared to be less a room than a thicket," unquote. Enabled by this architectural and cultural transformation, and tended by the domestic servants and gardeners who cared for these plants, the tropical became a pervasive fixture of the domestic interior, desired as much for the sensual pleasures of textured foliage and perfumed atmospheres as for the plant's symbolic registers. Beyond the sensibilities and tastes of the 19th century European, these tropical houseplants were also used in the home for their presumed health and sanitation benefits. Although the photos shown here reflect a wealthy class, houseplants were deployed as a form of self-care by a large cross-section of Victorian society. They were used to purify the polluted London air, aid respiration, and increase humidity in rooms heated by a hot furnace on cold winter days. Not limited to the British Empire, the abundant availability of tropical houseplants in Europe was a direct product of Western imperialism, when plant hunting and importing was at its height. The mad desire to produce a fragrant, sensual, and vital atmosphere through the profusion of palms, orchids, and ferns reflected a reciprocity between desire and empire, enabled by colonial power. Figuring prominently in these images of the domestic interior is a specimen of particular interest to us, the Ravenia rivularis, also known as the Majesty palm.
According to the text, a monograph of Ravenia, the Majesty palm is a species of tree native to south-central Madagascar along the Mangoki and Onilahi river systems. Their preferred habitat is shallow standing water on forested riverbanks, although the gardeners at Kew were able to germinate the Majesty palm in 1884. Today, while millions of specimens circulate abundantly and affordably around the world, you could buy them for just $14.99 at your local IKEA or $20 at Home Depot. The species is actually considered to be vulnerable in its indigenous habitat. Currently, an estimated 900 specimens survive in the wild, threatened by deforestation, pollution, and forest fires. In addition to the palm's environmental precarity, further contributing to the species' decline in the wild is its global popularity as a houseplant, driving unsustainably high levels of seed harvesting that prevent the palm from maintaining a robust population. So although it can grow to a height of 100 feet in the wild, since its domestication in the 1980s, it commonly takes the form of a modest potted palm inhabiting the background of our domestic spaces, leafy yet minimal, lush yet manageable. In Home Depot's product overview for the 10-inch Ravenia Majesty palm grown by Costa Farms, the plant is described as, quote, beautiful, arching, mid-green, feather-like fronds, adds beauty and class to any room, end quote. The palm's highly desirable tropical imagery, combined with the species' relative ease of industrial cultivation, has produced a quantitative imbalance between the number of species in its natural habitat compared to the number in the global distribution of domestic interiors. While there are millions of palms in circulation as houseplants, less than 1,000, again, specimens of Ravenia survive in the wild. This imbalance is also qualitative. Due to inadequate soil conditions, as well as the difficulty of maintaining the bright, warm, and humid atmosphere the plant requires, these transplanted Ravenia houseplants grow to only a fraction of their size and often fail to survive for more than a year. In fact, obsolescence is embedded into the living commodity itself. Around a third of houseplants purchased die within the first few months of being brought home.
So if the Ravenia exists more firmly in the flows of consumer capitalism than in the soil of its indigenous habitat, what does this global displacement of biomass reveal? Although IKEA's website claims the palm is native to Madagascar, the plant was in fact grown on non-indigenous soil, most likely Florida. In this case, the specimen's native range is used as a selling point for the commodity, fulfilling a consumer desire to cultivate quote, exotic houseplants. Does this so-called preservation of the Ravenia within the domestic interior constitute a new alibi for ecological stewardship? Or does this migration constitute yet another form of ecological imperialism? The ability to produce an impossible bouquet of imported tropical plants within the home creates a relationship with nature that implies a cheapness and abundance, concealing the environmental and logistical relationships that support these flows of exchange. This tropical commodity market is fueled by a profound desire to cultivate a specific fantasy of interior life, a Rousseauian dreamscape of lush foliage that requires careful cultivation. The trending of the tropical aesthetic, not just of the Ravenia rivularis, but also of the Monstera deliciosa and the Ficus lyrata, has resulted in a near ubiquity in hip interiors and well-kept homes, fetishized through lifestyle publications like Serial and Kinfolk that celebrate this vegetated incrustation. These ornamental houseplants are further marketed not only for their exotic imagery, but also for the presumed health and productivity benefits, repeating the trends of 19th century Europe. Countless lifestyle magazines and scientific studies tout the psychological, emotional, and physical advantages of indoor plant life. Articles claim that these companion species can reduce stress, improve indoor air quality, and even increase work-life efficiency. Yet it's likely the trend reflects more of a psychological need than an air quality problem. The foliage-filled interior serves as an ideal backdrop for the labors of self-care, providing comfort for its inhabitants as they cope with the increasing normalization of domestic confinement, as much due to the pandemic as to the contemporary collapse of work and life. The staging of the interior has been further streamlined through premium subscription plant services, like the sills featured here, whose popularity skyrocketed even before the pandemic, creating a must-have market for the home office. With an emphasis on productivity through wellness, these trends have transformed the labors of self-care into a prerequisite for high-output workflow. Or, as Gia Tolentino puts it ever so simply in her book, Trick Mirror, we must always be optimizing.
While acknowledging the particular status, social class, and privileged lifestyle to which these aesthetics are explicitly tied, viral worlds of botanical care have also produced novel solidarity networks of amateur horticulturalists. The houseplant remains one of the cheapest domestic luxuries and hobbies available. A cutting can be freely obtained, and all that is required is a little dirt, water, and light. From overwatering to oversharing, entire networks of YouTube DIY videos and care manuals for domestic flora have emerged as content producers image and distribute the techniques and results of domestic cultivation. In the wild, yet still highly commodified, spaces of TikTok worlding and reality shifting, users with #plantlife monikers discuss, quote, how to convince your plants you are one of them, or how to create interior ecosystems, pollinate plants, propagate cuttings, and make music for your foliated and sensing messmates. These digital trends reflect a desire for new formats of alliance between humans and the plants that they care for. However, these monstera manias and ficus fevers also reflect a neo-Victorian madness for an inexhaustible supply of trendy tropicals, a desire that is not without a hidden social and ecological cost. Returning to the Majesty palm, the main producer of Ravinia in the United States, as mentioned before in the Home Depot slide, is Costa Farms LLC, the largest producer of ornamental plants in the world. Costa Farms cultivates over 4,500 acres and employs over 5,000 people, and has production facilities in Florida, the Carolinas, the Dominican Republic, and now China. Like most agricultural work, horticulture is strenuous, low-paying, and precarious for its largely undocumented workforce. These conditions have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Recently, an article from the Miami Herald brought to light the toll of COVID-19 on workers at Costa Farms specifically. Horticultural workers, including those in ornamental plant nurseries, were deemed essential and had to continue working in person. Employees reported cramped working spaces and transit systems, making social distancing nearly impossible. Lack of masks, washing stations, and sufficient bathrooms contributed to multiple outbreaks in the Costa Farms facilities.
So it's critical to pay attention to these back of house infrastructures of labor, technology, and capital that fulfill our demand for these plants. Industrial greenhouses and horticultural distribution centers offer a novel interface with nature, characterized by sublime architectural environments of control and artifice. The current generation of greenhouse interior landscapes, immense in scale, create new sensorial atmospheres designed for the production of living species whose growth is maximized under conditions at odds with human occupation. Drones and cameras analyze growth, sensors optimize humidity and temperature, while energy-efficient LED grow lights perpetuate photosynthesis, creating eerie ecosystems in hectares of artificially illuminated and autonomously monitored specimens. The strangeness of these environments is a reflection of the out-of-placeness of these natures. So how can we cultivate our gardens without assuming the endless abundance of what Jason Moore describes as the cheap natures of labor, food, energy, and raw materials? Can we instead make visible the infrastructures of care, energy, and exchange required for the growth of each specimen? Instead of simply negating these conditions, how can we enhance the reciprocities of what Donna Haraway describes as, quote, the disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling of organic and inorganic systems?
So working both within and against these flows of commodified nature, we are interested in a new type of household equipment for the cultivation of non-human life. The project we're proposing asks how we might reformat our interior worlds, reorienting spatial arrangements, technologies, and labor habits towards the care of other organisms, such as the Ravinia rivularis. Any system sympathetic to the biological and environmental needs of the plant inherently alters the aesthetics that the tropical tableau presents. So what results from this set of requirements is a domestic object that juxtaposes its biotechnical systems with norms of domestic comfort, producing a Brechtian object whose size, disposition, and awkward kinetics resist the minimal tropical imaginaries cultivated by the likes of kinfolk. Composed of a lightweight aluminum truss structure, this domestic appliance is a cart constructed from 9 2-inch aluminum angles of various lengths, 2 handles, 2 rubber wheels, 1 aluminum axle, a sheet of 1/8 thick aluminum, and a threaded stabilizing rod. Spanning along the back of the truss, each cart is equipped with 6 red-blue spectrum-emitting LED lights designed for horticultural systems to stimulate the abundant growth of leafy foliage. The red-blue lights efficiently index the photosynthetic conditions of the palm's home range, producing a glowing pink proxy for the tropical climate.
This simple machine is neither a utilitarian appliance nor a luxury object. It's a new type of sensorial accessory, one that makes visible the technical systems required for the nurturing of imported and other ecologies. This visual promiscuity of the palm's suspended fronds, the straight lines of the aluminum truss, and the pink glow of the red-blue spectrum lights produces a tableau in which plants, their habitats, and their interrelational ecologies are not sterile backdrops, but living, transpiring, and confrontational entities. The project examines how domestic confinement has redefined not just social life, but has extended the regimes of care to produce a new bond between humans and non-humans. The overly large, awkwardly mobile, and weirdly ambient object renders visible these forms of kinship through a discomforting proximity within the domestic interior. The cart's capacity for constant repositioning dislodges the familiar arrangements and habits of private life, opening up new structures for cohabitation, socialization, and of course, cultivation. The glowing lights produce an ambient yet agonistic form of coexistence, intimately confronting the human cohabitant. The space, bathed in the artificial pink wash of the grow lights, lays bare the explicitly energy-intensive and alien qualities of the imported plant's ideal habitat. The aluminum shelf supports the heavy weight of the plant, as well as the evidence of the dirty work of cultivation: earthy piles, stray leaf clippings, misting bottles, and soiled gloves. These machines produce legible forms of stewardship between companion species and their human caretakers, or vice versa, operating within the technical, ecological, and social systems of survival to propose new notions of creaturely comfort. Echoing Sarah Ahmed's call for the reorientation of our bodies and their spatial relations, we have the task of, quote, making the familiar strange, or even allowing that which has been overlooked, which has been treated as furniture, to dance with renewed life, end quote. An important task for architecture. Disturbing the familiar spaces of our usually well-tempered and well-kept domestic sphere is a harsh pink glow, creating an atmosphere that is distinctly unfamiliar, disorienting. Walls become pink, whites become green, and greens transform into dull and ruddy crimson. Immersed in the denatured profusion of Ravinia fronds, and also in constant risk of receiving a censure from an HOA suspecting your involvement in a clandestine horticultural enterprise, of course, we are confronted with a domestic space that is distinctly not in keeping with the usually understated and minimal interiors of the cultivated life. This condition of unkeptness demands a rethinking of care and its attendant aesthetics.
While modernism sought to de-encrust the interiors of everyday life, are there ways of maintaining the wildness of the Victorian interior, prioritizing infrastructures of care rather than fetishizing the horticultural products of colonial exchange? Instead of replicating the passivity of the Victorian odalisque, how can we produce an immersive and artificial interior, absorbing the technical systems, logistical chains, and infrastructures of care into the domestic space? Can we look instead to a different interior sensibility? Shown here in the aptly named Garden in Hell reclines Diana Vreeland, former Vogue editor, jauntily showing off the salon of her New York City apartment designed by Billy Baldwin in 1971. Red walls, dense and saturated, produce an atmospheric interior that is unfamiliar and unsettling, filled with restless surfaces and figures, wallpapers, curtains, mirrors, pillows, ornaments. The architecture visually collapses into the patterns that teem over it. Although Vreeland is centered in the space and framed by the room, there is a degree of indeterminacy between her body and the room's aggressive floral motifs. the wildness of the surface, and the overwhelming color red both undermine and exalt the bodies in the room, human, furniture, plants, and otherwise. While the well-kept room, maybe in Kinfolk magazine or featured on the sill, appears on the surface to be quietly tended and tenderly maintained, is there instead a possibility of offering a stranger tableau, a restructuring of our habits and homes through these conditions of care could offer new intimacies, hybrids, and gestures? What technical systems, environmental atmospheres, and material assemblies can be imported into the domestic interior to refamiliarize ourselves with the secret lives of our creaturely cohabitants? Jane Hutton writes in her recent book, Reciprocal Landscapes, that, quote, if at the core of current ecological crises lies a profound separation from land, from the consequences and interdependencies that humans share with the land, how can material design engage this? She continues, quote, the textures, smells, structures of particular materials give people tactile and intimate contact with fragments of distant landscapes and their myriad social and ecological relationships. Is it possible to engage more intimately and deeply, not just with the land and its specimens, but also the sensuous qualities of these life support systems, making visible the biological, environmental, and technical preconditions for their maintenance and care? And with that, I'll say thank you.
Great, thank you. So the third panel, F architecture. So the Feminist Architecture Collaborative, also known as F Architecture, was established in 2016 by Virginia Black, Rosana Elkhatib, and Gabrielle Printz. F Architecture is an architectural research enterprise aimed at disentangling the contemporary spatial politics of bodies, both intimately and globally. Their projects traverse theoretical and material registers to locate new forms of architectural work through critical relationships with collaborators across continents and an expanding definition of designer. They were the recipients of the 2019 Architectural League Prize, and their writing and work have appeared in Harvard's Design Magazine, eFlux, The Funambulist, Real Review, and Log, as well at institutions including the Morgan Library Museum, Studio X Amman, Universität der Kunst Berlin, the Frac Center Delors, and Habitat. Thank you so much, Virginia, Rosana, and Gabrielle. Welcome, and take it away.
Okay, yes, thank you for inviting us, Brittany, to ruminate on care with this really great collection of thinkers and practitioners. I suspect that our contribution will be a little bit more self-conscious, so thank you for indulging us. We definitely cite ourselves on this axis between care and work, both producing as some kind of architects and reproducing ourselves as laboring bods, closing out the Google Doc when the migraine prodrome comes on. Obviously, this comes to bear on the work that we are able to do in the context of F architecture, and the work that we must also do to support ourselves alongside of it. But we're happy to have this opportunity to reflect on what it means to care in the context of our practice. Care is something that is apparently quotidian, women's work or not. We are reminded in its everydayness that care is a structural feature of life, but it's also heightened in moments of crisis. We must care, and now especially, not just under the circumstances of the pandemic, but in the utter abandon of state support. That was a crisis that we were already laboring under. The daily routines of caring tend to emphasize maintenance work, the wearing out and restoration of our waking bodies. But we wonder about those acts of care that occur at night while dreaming, while gazing out the window or into each other's eyes. In other words, how does the maintenance of oneself and one's family and the family that we've chosen in each other find renewal and fantasy and in forms of collectivity, which are intellectual and emotional as they are physical and material? I guess care for us is central to the way that we understand and invite collaborative work, something that includes shouldering burdens and sharing desires. In that sense, collaboration isn't the panacea of feminist practice that it's often held up to be, a virtuous mode of teamwork predicated on the illusion of pure harmony, of frictionless coming together without agonism. But we see it as something that requires a lot of effort, understanding, and commitment to care. a giving up of yourself to realize something truly mutual. What acts of and dispositions toward care are required to support the extreme vulnerability of collaboration? And how does that sense of collaboration live beyond our triangulation of interests and capacities? So today we'll narrate a few collaborative acts among our projects in which we conspire against the state, white institutions and settler agendas, the endurance of cishet patriarchy, and the exigencies of capital, which also constitute and mobilize those oppressive forms. We locate those concerns within a mode of practice that begins with building relationships and reciprocity, including between ourselves.
To be clear, F Architecture is not a collective. We are not a membership organization or the kind of open constituency that many people wanted us to be, something that was also for them or for all women who practice. The way we work, the means by which we attempt to invite something careful into the world begins with us, between us and for us, which isn't to say that we profit from it, but it is the work that we want to do. A kind of social production that extends beyond us, that is only possible through the intense and intimate alliance that we have formed. As three people, we've agreed to work with a kind of idealism under conditions that are less than ideal, which means we can announce projects that won't receive funding. We can adjust our priorities when things must change. We put pressure on each other to learn more about those things that require more study. We cede control and trust each other to alternate roles, to define projects, but also to support them. It's a kind of nimble commitment born out of necessity, fantasy, and an ethos of care that is structural, a melding of desires that provides for something stronger and that we hope will allow us to endure. We have built a kind of internal understanding upon which our mutual interests can be represented. So how does that translate into forms of understanding that make for meaningful, caring relationships with those we work with or for? And today we'll like to speak about two projects in specific. One involving a form of collaboration with multiple constituents, an organization of indigenous midwives called unpacking, and with the anthropologist Georgia Ennis to create a peaceful act of protest in Quito, Ecuador. And another that activates the voices of women we have not met in a kind of clinical cyberspace. Working through concepts of empathy and with VR techniques, we sought a mode of representation and engagement that was sensitive and meaningful, but that didn't overpromise a perfect understanding of another's life.
So starting with unpacking, I wanted to introduce the project we called Representative Bodies with a specific story about my own transformed understanding of feminist care, which began when I went to Ecuador to study Quichua, which is an indigenous language native to the Andes and Amazon region. And I met several Quechua women who were teaching at the school that I studied at. There, I learned from them what it meant to be a Sinchi Warmi, or a strong woman, one capable of transforming her own life through her agency, one who dealt with the difficult aspects of life by meeting them with her own strength, who supported others by crying beautifully and laughing beautifully. In those circumstances, a woman's ability to cry and cry with others is not seen as a weakness, but as a strength. When someone cries, you cry with them as a sign of support. And so when I left Ecuador following my summer study, and specifically when I left Quito following this project that I'm about to talk about, I began to tear up, and I looked out to see my own tears reflected in the eyes of each of the mamas, a visible sign, which was also a performative gesture meant to ensure I knew I wasn't going through my emotions alone. And within this context of learning in the field and from Sinchi Warmis, I visited and developed a relationship with the midwives and shamans who ran Amupakin, a center founded to integrate Western medicine with indigenous birthing, healing, and cultivation practices undertaken in the Amazon rainforest for centuries. Through the cultivation of the rainforest, Amupakin also extends forms of care to non-human actors, which include plants, animals, and spirit entities, constituting a network of social relations and forms of spatial development that are particular to rainforest culture and life. So when UN Habitat declared its intention to hold its third bidecennial conference in Quito, so one conference every 20 years, we applied to design an exhibition space for the conference where we would formalize unpacking presence among national governments and NGOs, and to potentially attract financial support, investors, and funding. Representative Bodies was a series of designed occupations and appearances across multiple formats, including an act of peaceful protest, a publication, a conversation, an act of live drawing, and a space of economic exchange. This also required coordinating the logistics to actually get them to Quito, and all of these were efforts to assert the image and presence of an indigenous rural identity and to communicate Amazonian political life as expressed through the not exclusively human design and construction of the rainforest, alongside the representatives of UN Habitat's New Urban Agenda. So following our proposal for unpacking to occupy a space in the exhibition at Habitat, we received an acceptance letter. Unpacking could present and sell their work from a booth, which would cost $4,000. And for reference, midwives typically make around $15 a month. At that price, we ultimately couldn't be accommodated by the UN's preference for the urban, which essentially priced out the people who were least represented there. Exactly the circumstances that incite protest. But bureaucracy, like the NGOs and financial institutions that cohere in UN Habitat, isn't designed to care about the experiences of those it cannot see. So we diverted the few funds that we raised to get them to the capital in Quito, so they might assert their own presence outside of the organizing logics of the exhibition as a delegation of Amazonian Quechua women. And then just to speak for a minute about the risk of speaking out, a part of the project was to understand what forms of visibility and ways of speaking and articulating potentially dissent could accommodate the forms of risk the women had to confront. Following a summer of political unrest the year prior, wherein the government had been actively punishing dissenters and bribing and extorting Indigenous leaders and politicians, an overt display of antagonism was not an option. So because the women are shamans, here they performed cleansing rituals on conference participants, occupying the space despite not being allowed to participate otherwise. And you can see them offering this cleansing to one of the UN Habitat attendees here, which we understood to be a simultaneous act of care and protest. So this performance didn't fit into the grammar of the exhibition, and in that sense was able to exert some resistance to the regime of representation codified by UN Habitat. We attempted to address the struggle for and through representation, but also more immediate practical concerns. So in order to capitalize on their appearance in the city, we wanted to make an opportunity for them to sell their goods, which they sold in a park and at an event in a local art museum called Arte Actual. While their appearance garnered a lot of attention, it wasn't the kind that we hoped for, in the form of alliances, international collaborations, or donations. And you can see here officials posing with them, but they didn't inquire about their organization or really offer to support it. And next you see this photo of Adela Alvarado, then president of unpacking, being interviewed by the Evening News, who decided to speak in Spanish over her segment, which was originally recorded in Quechua. And on the program, she was also not acknowledged as the president of unpacking, but as a Quechua grandmother. Even as they arrived in Quito with great knowledge of cultural, medicinal, and spatial practice, as those appointed within their communities to guard and disseminate it, their appearance was subject to misinterpretation and their knowledge to a kind of erasure. And each of these events are shaped by performances of various kinds, challenging us to design appearances that also allow for material needs to be met. We want to ask, what skills do we have as designers to shape the ways these appearances are received or understood? And so we attempted to collaborate with them in the ways that we could, as organizers, enablers, stagehands, etc. Resistance entails this kind of dedicated support and care.
In another part of the world, we return to think through questions of body, representation, and the role of design in mediating value, not just in an economic sense, but culturally specific values that act in this case on the bodies and desires of women. We've made a series of projects that have tried to see the cultural production of virginity, particularly by its appearance on local and global markets in the commodity form of the artificial hymen and the service of surgical hymen reconstruction. The concept of honor and its bodily expressions organize the lives of women and girls across the world, but particularly in the MENA region. And this is a concept that I grew up with in Palestine and Jordan as a kind of pillar of propriety, a way that assesses mine and other women's values in society. The hymen is a little seen but much discussed threshold of belonging, something that can only exist in its intactness until the event of its ceremonial rupture in a marital bed. So naturally, this was a topic that required our scrutiny, and only to prove something to my mother. Where in the world is the production of virginity is a question that required constituting and inhabiting and remaking all of these spaces where the hymen circulated, where this part of the anatomy is made to take on a visibility and a currency in the world. There is a long answer to this question, and we've presented on this before, but for the purpose of this focus on care, we'd like to talk about one aspect of a research project and exhibition we did called Cosmoclinical Interiors of Beirut. The economy of bodily modification enjoys a kind of capital in Beirut, an excess of surgical tourism and the manufacture of Arab pop star beauty. So mapping the geographic distribution of the clinics, like the very expressive Dr. Nassar Hospital, which you see here, or the boutique stylings of the not yet built hotel clinic of Dr. Nader Saab, we started to assemble what we call the meta clinic map, which is a reproduction of connected interiors. The space is dressed to accommodate the desires and pressures placed on women. So from the outset, we were orienting this project towards a virtuality in which certain experiences might play out at a distance from the intensity of the operating room and its attended spaces. In doing so, we navigated the tension between material artifact and the affective dimension of virginity culture by reproducing what we were finding in our fieldwork in Beirut. Through drawings and designed environments, we maintained an awareness about what it means to represent this set of conditions without placing undue pressure on the body and the choices of Arab women. We scrutinized the idiosyncratic designs of the interior environments where hymenoplastic services were rendered and represented them in an exhibition where we installed reconstructions of the clinic amalgam, including hymen objects that might be worn or applied as perfume, sat in like a chair, such that the hymen itself, as something designed, becomes part of the design space of the clinic or lab where it's made and remade. One of the spaces in our reproduced clinic environment is a room for self-examination, where a chair allows you to recline and see yourself, building on a tradition of women situated between cushions and hand mirrors. This position of recline in the self-exam chair of the exhibition is also a point of access to the VR version of the clinic. Adorning yourself with the headset, you see up from the stirrups of the virtual exam room where surgical tools float above your head, and you hear the voices of others in your ear, narrating their own experiences with such a procedure. These voices amplifying the VR space are collected from printed interviews with anonymous women identified only by initials, from stories whispered to me by a friend or a friend of a friend. Women recount the moments they felt that the only option for their survival was to undergo the operation, or those who navigated heartbreak and the weight of presenting a physical proof of an intact hymen. We collaborated with women who lent their voices to tell these stories in both Arabic and English, providing us with an opportunity for disclosure without revealing anything that might put the interlocutor at risk. As we focused closely on intimate operations on the body, we wanted to respect the distance in the face of incredible vulnerability. The VR scene is one that heightens a sense of proximity to the embodied vision and intimate experience of another, and not just the void of the user that VR assumes. But in our case, the position of actual women who had undergone these procedures. In trying to design a kind of sensitivity to the experience of another, we also have to understand the limits of empathy, that it is impossible to know that experience, but it should not prevent us from seeking an ever closer kind of understanding.
So to wrap up, we'd like to return again to our own intimate constituency, a getting closer to each other that often happens online like it is now, and in the DMs of several apps, in the edit pane of the Google Doc. Even before we became confined to our home offices where the workday is 24 hours, we have written in short bursts to each other, blurbs that try to do the work, make a joke, account for feelings, or reserve time at a later date to do the thinking, laughing, or sobbing. Is this a rant? Is it an essay? Cry reacts only. Writing together in large format for esteemed journals and other publications has historically been an emotional task for us. We try to inhabit one voice, which in general feels good and safe and powerful. But the work of churning out the word count, of toiling for meaning, has occasioned many feelings. And the writing that we've done together for money or clout, or just because it must be said, has allowed us to think through the terms under which we can produce and when it is just not possible. It's been some time since we were asked to write about the teenager for Harvard Design Magazine for an issue called 17, edited by Jennifer Siegler and Leah Whitman-Salkin, which we gleefully used as an opportunity to write about Princess Nokia, the rapper and superstar, but also productive unreality and the political nature of teen dreamin'. For me, this piece was primarily written and edited from a laptop in a bed in my parents' house in California, where I was caring for my mom while she recuperated from a cerebral hemorrhage. An aneurysm had been growing in her brain undetected through her life, and the pain of its rupture was indistinguishable from the migraines that she had suffered through adulthood. So I left New York, my partner and my partners in F architecture, to be with her and my family. There was just no other option. And fortunately, it was possible to do that. And I was away for 3 months, spent hospital room sitting, and then attending the slow and painful recovery at home, where she had to learn to speak and walk again. So I was writing through a kind of teenage resistance when I had reactivated in some way this really surreal version of my own teenage experience. And writing served as a tether to Virginia and Rosana, an anchor to the work that we were still doing and the support network that we had formed that was so accommodating of the leave of absence I had to take, and accommodating also of me as a total mess. I needed to do this work to feel like I was still part of this thing that we had built, but my capacity to do so was so limited. And the conflicting signals that they were getting from me required a level of understanding that that could negotiate this kind of fuzzy border between work and care, what it means to do work with and for each other under impossible circumstances. So my mom is fine. And I would like to say that I've learned some kind of lesson about taking time to retreat from the space of work, but it's something that we're all still working on.
This past year, with its many discomforts and losses, could also be instructive. Many of us continue to care and labor under loss for which there hasn't been time or space to process, but we know it's there, however inarticulable. 2020 has, if anything, reminded us of the necessity to retreat from work, at least that work we are able to retreat from, not that which determines our livelihoods and secures our homes. But the three of us, like many more people, have lost those opportunities too. We would prefer not to, should be a choice, not a luxury. And if you saw that horrific New York Times Magazine article from a few weeks ago, you know who is picking up the slack. In the vacuum of material, institutional, and public support, the provision of fuck all under these circumstances of loss, only the demand to make the most of your time at home. The question of who is afforded the capacity to retreat in these circumstances is an urgent one. Who gets to exercise self-care, remain in the comfort of their homes, or flee to Cancun? Who must sacrifice to do the essential work? These structural questions are expressed and renegotiated in the relationships we choose to build with others. In the absence of support, we have to try and model practices that are primarily interpersonal. This is the tight web of support in which we tried to manifest care through reciprocity, trust, and sensitivity. This requires work, but also understanding when work simply cannot be done. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, Rosana, and Virginia, for that really powerful statement. Really appreciate it. And so we're last to our final panel, or our final speaker for this panel, Fabiola López-Durán. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. Fabiola López-Durán is an associate professor of art and architectural history at Rice University. Originally trained as an architect, Fabiola earned her Ph.D. in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture from MIT. Adopting a transnational and interdisciplinary perspective, her research and teaching interrogates the cross-pollination of ideas and mediums, science, politics, and aesthetics that ignited the process of modernization on both sides of the Atlantic, with an emphasis on Latin America. Her broad research agenda focuses on non-Western modernisms and the complicities between capitalism, racism, and the construction of the built environment. Her book, Eugenics in the Garden, Transatlantic Architecture and the Crafting of Modernity, investigates a particular strain of eugenics that, at the turn of the 20th century, moved from the realms of medicine and law to design, architecture, and urban planning, becoming a critical instrument in the crafting modernity. This book received an SAH Mellon Author Award in 2018 and was a winner of the Robert Motherwell Book Prize in 2019. Thank you so much, Fabiola, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Brittany, for inviting me to this incredible journey of fascinating works. What I wanted to say is that before I start, is that what I'm going to share with you today will take us to the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And it is a paper that combines the seeds of two books, my book on eugenics that was published 2 years ago, and a new book that is still in its infancy that I call Mid-Milieu. And it's a very troubling history that I think is still valuable today and that looks at care from a completely different perspective. So let me start. So deciphering the binary code of medicine and society under the spell of landscape architecture. This talk interrogates the central but overlooked trope of modern architecture, its clinical agenda. As I will show, in early 20th century Argentina, this agenda sought to ameliorate the health of an ailing nation with architecture as a medical instrument, as a national project of healing and social reform. Focusing on a network of parks, gardens, and open-air schools, and sport facilities, this talk reveals how these complex technological systems emerge from prophylactic and pronatalist perspective of the human body, rationalizing gender and sexuality, and instrumentalizing production and reproduction for both the economic and the biological improvement of the nation. Beginning in the mid-1880s, Argentina became determined to modernize by transforming its built environment and at the same time engineering its population. At the center of this quest were two influential movements, hygienics and eugenics. Hygienics was conceived as a comprehensive program of reform for reconstituting and reorganizing human life, including bacteria, space, air, water, and of course, human behavior. Eugenics emerged as a social and biological movement that strove for nothing less than the improvement of the human race, embracing both heredity and environment as its primary tools to whiten the population. So the fear of degeneration that haunted French society during the late 19th century took a turn in modern Argentina, a country that looked to France for scientific and cultural inspiration. It was precisely this fear of degeneration, the self-reproducing force that plunged the individual body and society into a state of decay and extinction, which provoked the implementation of a new form of hygiene, social hygiene, a set of economic and moral practices preoccupied with the influence arising from the milieu and the fruits of human capital, production and reproduction. It is not surprising that the practice of social hygiene will emerge in a country committed to advancing urban hygiene, which following Haussmann materialized progress through modernized infrastructure and circulation of goods and people. According to French Nathalie Sicard de Plossol, social hygiene was an economic science that looks simultaneously to land and bodies, producing and reproducing human capital, while training and augmenting this same capital through professional education and sports. In other words, people had become a resource that required tending. But optimizing human capital was complicated. By the turn of the century in the province of Buenos Aires, urban and rural spaces were reconceived as spaces of medicalization and productivity. Three movements of peoples and animals changed the face of the city of Buenos Aires and the surrounding pampas. First, in order to prepare the territory for modernization, a military operation displaced and killed thousands of Indians along with the so-called racially inferior gauchos. Second, following Argentinian political theorists, I cannot speak English today, Juan Bautista Alberdi's call to think of population in agricultural terms, politicians, scientists, and technocrats developed a plan for the cultivation of a new, more industrious white European population. And third, a series of laws were implemented to prohibit further unhygienic meat processing within city limits and to reroute incoming undesirable immigrants to the countryside, to the meat packing districts in the south of the city. All this in the interest of eliminating all living bodies, those of animals and humans, thought to carry pests and diseases, both physical and ideological. Through these lenses of medicalization and productivity, this talk now turns to the very methodology adopted by the states and elites to transform human beings into optimal generators of capital through the dual apparatus of modern architecture and landscape design. So let me start with the first one, parks and gardens. So in Buenos Aires, there was no more prolific urban apparatus conceived in the service of healthcare than the parks and plazas designed during the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. And for the Argentine elites, there were no more attractive designers to imagine these spaces than the French landscapes architects and urbanists, trained under the influence of the New Green Paris and the New Green Paris and the city design with its hygienic and moralizing public parks created under Napoleon III by Baron Haussmann and landscape architect Adolphe Alphand. Without a doubt, Paris was the first source of inspiration for modern Buenos Aires, which led to former President Domingo Sarmiento's desire to transform Buenos Aires into a civilized French and mercantile city. Sarmiento's obsession with civilizing the barbarians, civilizar la barbarie, as he displays in his influential book, was at the core of his motivation to create a grand public park and the first neighborhood gardens for the Argentinian capital. This is the former president under whose watch the military marched into the Argentina Pampas, massacred the indigenous population. So now, to create a grand metropolitan park in Buenos Aires, Sarmiento turned to hygienists, such as the physician Eduardo Weil, who argue for the creation of urban parks to send surges of oxygen to the city, to regenerate our blood, because every city needs, as an essential hygienic element, the proximity of a neighborhood jungle, a forest, a plain, that is, sites with trees. But Sargento imagined something more. Inspired by North American rural cemeteries and Frederick Law Olmsted Park in Boston and New York, Sarmiento visualized a metropolitan park as a planning instrument, as a technical device to control the territory and modernize its population. For him, a grand park should be a genuine technical laboratory, an educational and productive machine, a new type of space capable of embracing civilization values and of burying in its cultivating green the last sprouts of Asian barbarism. This new park concept gave rise to what architectural historian Adrian Gorelick has described as a medium for restoration, a restoration of a degraded city, of a segmented society, a regeneration of deviant conduits of nature and memory. So in 1902, at the inauguration of Parque de los Patricios, Mayor Adolfo Bullrich addressed the young men from the correctional prison who built the park, telling them that their instincts and perversions will be replaced with more desirable productive habits through the civilizing benefits of parks. According to Bullrich, these prisoners, now, quote, converted into useful citizens for the country and the family, end quote, were the first beneficiaries of Patricios Park. In this way, the central area of the city, once the site of animal slaughter and processing, became one of life and regeneration. In the following decades, green spaces were designed and used as instruments of urban renewal, as a way to gentrify the most unsavory neighborhoods, adding a social and economic function to the aesthetic and environmental ones. Parks and plazas were no longer conceived as mere representations of the pastoral, aimed at the bourgeois mise-en-scène. Rather, they were seen in the context of the demographics of the city as clinics for healing, controlling, and producing better citizens. In the early 1920s, Buenos Aires Mayor Carlos Noel invited landscape architect Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier, a member of the Parisian Musée Social, an interdisciplinary institution devoted to mitigating the social problems of modern France, to develop an urban master plan for the capital city. Instrumentalizing urban planning as the principle for social hygiene, Forestier designed a system of parks and gardens that would improve the population as well as the physical attributes of the city. Particular attention to parks and gardens and their potential therapeutic use was thus driven by the conviction that planning was, quote, of primordial importance to the physical development of our race and its moral and intellectual elevation, end quote. Various types of gardens were organized within the system. Metropolitan parks that link the city with the region and preserve natural reserve. Urban parks located in various parts of the city with its civic centers and sport facilities, including the landfills along the river, the Costanera parks with its beaches, and commons and tree-lined boulevards were also established along the coast. In addition, Forestier proposed neighborhood gardens with playgrounds for children offset from the streets, enclosed by plantings and under the surveillance of women. Forestier claimed that his long-standing preoccupation with designing neighborhood gardens arose from a belief in the regenerative power of green space and its ability to promote labor productivity through sports, fresh air, and healthier lifestyles. So eugenics, the movement that British scientist Francis Galton defined as a science to deal with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, gave scientific authority to social fears, respectability to class and racial prejudice, legitimacy to the claim that white people were the embodiment of a modernized society, and power to modern architecture and landscape design to produce the scientific spaces to improve the nation. The form of eugenics adopted in Argentina, known as Lamarckian eugenics, was based on Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, wherein evolution was driven by adaptation to environmental changes, in contrast to mainstream eugenics, which view evolution as impervious to environment and driven solely by genetics. So in this sense, Lamarckian eugenics was basically making this big call to architecture to become the technology of eugenics. So to activate Lamarckian eugenics sweeping agenda, parks and gardens became platforms for new technical agencies dedicated to scrutinizing and improving the psychophysical makeup of specific populations groups. Within this apparatus, women and children became the main subject of pseudoscientific analysis and state control. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Argentine physician Emilio Coni, who emphasized the importance of puericulture, a faith-infused science revitalized as a human analog to agriculture, but for the scientific nurturing of the modern child unit, launched a new architectural typology for the education and cultivation of children's bodies, the open-air school. Inspired by the French École de plein air, this new dispositif that function more as clinics than schools, more as gardens than buildings, were established for the recovery of the so-called weak children. However, the schools include a mechanism for identifying the so-called abnormals, who they view as unable to be rehabilitated. Falling somewhere between sanatorium, school, and garden, the open-air school was simply thought of as the school of regeneration. Coni, along with other physicians, believed that weak children were a product of heredity and milieu. According to him, they were the result of their progenitors' alcoholism, tuberculosis, and syphilis, combined with the malnutrition, lack of hygiene, and the substandards of inadequate conditions of their homes. At the open-air schools, these weak children could undergo education, treatment, and regeneration in therapeutic spaces. Open from September to May and divided into 3-month cycles, the schools received children selected from the city's public schools who had been evaluated by a medical academic committee and considered backwards in their physical or intellectual developments. In these schools located in the center of major public parks, children received their academic curricula under shady trees. They underwent curative, sunbathing, physical workouts, and directed games on well-kept lawns, took showers together, and ate nutritious meals in orderly, hygienic facilities. From dawn to dusk, the children were taught in a healthy environment and under the vigilant eye of both teacher and physicians. A medical examination was conducted every 15 days to evaluate each child, monitoring important data such as weight, thoracic capacity, muscular strength, biochromical and thoracic diameters, visual and auditory alertness and acuity, and improvement in intelligence. Convinced that children's bodies were malleable enough to be improved, these physicians and teachers equated beauty with the light skin complexion of white Argentines, and European immigrants, and fitness with well-proportioned muscular body and erect posture. A 1912 study written by Argentine physician Hamilton Casinelli argued that these new therapeutic and medicalized spaces were for children who had the capacity to be easily perfectible. In other words, for children who the regular school finds not normal enough and the hospital finds not sick enough. Yet to select these children, the guidelines establish a process similar to the one implemented for the identification of criminals, taking frontal and profile photos of each child, as well as their fingerprints, together with a report regarding their character, intelligence, and attitude. Offering fresh air, sunlight, and a sense of freedom and welfare for future citizens of the new world, this school masked a new system of surveillance and control over children's health and education that was part of larger eugenics aspirations for the improvement of the biological capital of the nation. However, the critical strategy to foster this new typology was not only in the hands of physicians. Architects took the stage in this social engineering project, actively formulating a special strategy of child saving. In 1912, the French architect and Musée Social member, Adolphe Rey, delivered a talk titled The School of the Future. In his talk, Rey called for a new type of a school building capable of bolstering children's health, recognizing the power of architecture, quote, to exert a profound influence on the overall development of the race, end quote. The open-air school, Rey argued, should therefore be like nursery, where the young plant develops and strengthens. For Rey, as for the physicians and educators in Argentina, the open-air school was the modern greenhouse of a better race. Although functioning in makeshift spaces that were part of urban parks and gardens, the open-air schools attracted architects whose early visions condensed the clinical agenda that modern architecture will come to embody. Open and flexible classrooms with large-scale sliding windows or glass folding walls facing patios and gardens, roof terraces, balconies, and sheltered areas for gardening and relaxation, accompany clean and modern facilities for children's hygiene and medical examination. These elements, which will be emulated in the architectural design of modern schools and working class homes, arose from the conviction that fresh air, sunlight, exercise, and hygiene will contribute to a new generation of healthier working class and thus to the productivity and economic health of the nation. So let me finish with the sport facilities in the mid-working and in the mid districts. So, however, children were not the only targets of biopolitics. So from 1880, when Buenos Aires was declared the capital of the Republic, to 1940, when Argentina became one of the largest producers of meat in the world, new institutions supporting social hygiene were created to transform the city into a medicalized object and the countryside into a healthy, productive machine. Among these institutions was the Museo Social Argentino, inspired by the Parisian Museo Social, acted as a mediator between the state and the agro-industrial world. For this new Argentinian Museo Social, the rural domain was the perfect platform for modernizing the country and its cities. Capitalizing on cattle as the country's primary asset and thinking of people as agricultural crops, the Museo Social Argentino lobbied to bring the right kind of immigrants into the sparsely populated countryside to run the nation's agricultural industries. In this way, the meat industry created a scientifically supported arena for the biopolitical appropriation of land and resources, including human and non-human animal bodies, bearing out a unified ideology of medicalization, aestheticization, urbanization, and production. More specifically, modern meat processing plants implemented a system for the medicalization and training of workers' bodies at the same time as they were establishing a medicalized system for cleaning, killing, inspecting, dissecting, and packing animals, making the whole process more efficient, hygienic, and profitable. A firm belief in medical science and the corrective capacity of architecture and landscape architecture motivated the creation of a series of new spaces within the industrial landscape. To increase industrial productivity, aseptic laboratories, medical examination rooms, facilities for workers' personal hygiene, and sports fields for workers' physical exercise and recreation were incorporated within meat packing districts. Between the 1880s and the 1940s, sports and outdoor recreation grounds for employees became a common component of industrial welfare programs in many countries to facilitate workers' recruitment and foster contentment and loyalty. At Frigorifico Gualeguaychú, for instance, this program was a comprehensive biopolitical apparatus that went beyond providing medical exams and dental care to its workers. The land in front of the industrial complex was divided. On one side, a garden was planted with young trees and bushes for the aesthetic pleasure of visitors. On the other side, stockyards and outdoor processing facilities, including cleansing stalls and ramps, were designed and built in such a way as to ensure efficient work processes. Nature and industry were both juxtaposed and combined, announcing the hygienic and systematized treatment of animals and its powerful place within the corporate sector. The back of the complex along the river featured a landscape for an equally important function, improving workers' productivity. There, basketball and volleyball courts, soccer fields, and grounds for gymnastics display a clear and orderly image of nationalist educational and welfare activities. Such sport grounds were a spatial expression of the fact that physical exercise had become an instrument to ameliorate labor performance in the industry. By adopting this social program, the Frigorifico Gualeguaychú had become an industrial model, garnering ample financial support as well as earning powerful national and international reputation. This model was, and still is, presented in newspapers and other outlets as a simple expression of the company's altruistic motivations rather than as a profit-seeking behavior. Thus, it is critical to remember that parks, gardens, and open-air schools were created also as an efficient apparatus for social hygiene and eugenics, and that the corporation's sport fields, orderly athletic activities, and cow pastures presented the rural industrial complex as an utopian meat-producing microcosm within which monoculture flourished. Bodies were reduced to an impossible pure biology, and nature, constructed or otherwise, became the vehicle for biopolitics and corporate power. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much, Fabiola. That's fantastic. If I could ask the panelists to turn on their videos, and I would like to encourage the public, the participants, to feel free to answer questions or ask questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We have a couple questions already, but maybe I'd like to sort of sorry, I'm just trying to fix my Zoom. 1 second. But I'd like to start with, maybe this is a provocation to, it's kind of a way to tie in Gia's work, Fabiola's work, the work of F architecture, and also the kind of the ideology of the houseplant is I'm really curious about the capacity for an institution to make labor visible, to make ideology visible, for better or for worse, right? To kind of flaunt an ethos, to flaunt an agenda, both kind of a redemptive agenda, but perhaps also kind of a highly sort of structured or biopolitically controlling agenda. And you know, it's interesting, Fabiola, just when you describe the open air schools and how they're both schools, but they're also gardens, and there's kind of a pleasure in that, and there's kind of a desirability for that, especially in terms of our kind of current pandemic. I was wondering maybe you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the ideology of the institution and how the architecture is both in some ways neutral to that ideology, but also instrumentalized by that ideology. And also any panelist or anyone feel free to jump in. I just wanted to kind of get it started.
With Fabiola's talk, I was just sort of thinking about like how one would situate you know, a really robust history of managerial science and health within like a feminist discourse on ethics of care, because they're just so like opposite to one another, right? Because I think that, you know, feminist conversations on care have always been thinking about ways out of that productivist logic of health management, or like thinking about itself as like an antidote to health management. And then I think all the different presentations today have been trying to find like examples that could get manifested in practice. So I don't know, this is more like a question of Fabiola, because, you know, on the one hand, this is a scholarly work that you are engaging with very deeply. And then on the other hand, I was just sort of, I think the question to you, I was just thinking, you know, this is like, how would you think through like this early history of modernist management, and then, sorry, my Zoom is getting all crazy because someone's pinning things, and then where we can like, I don't even know how to, and how do we look at that with the new kinds of perspectives we have right now, trying to think outside of hard logics or productivist science, and, you know, as both a scholar, but maybe I think as a feminist, how that gets brought together in some way. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud really, because they're very, I feel like all of his conversations is a kind of like counterweight to, you know, but a counterweight to these perspectives that were emerging in Argentina, of course, and also still in our present day, the management of health today, right?
Yeah, I think that there are several answers for that question, but I will say that race and gender were instrumentalized by science at the beginning of the 20th century through eugenics in a way that was very efficient, right? And the way that eugenics instrumentalized architecture, like Lamarckian eugenics in particular, that was the form of eugenics that was implemented in Latin Europe and in Latin America, just to give a big picture. Use architecture and a sort of naivete, I will say, of architecture, of pretending being completely out of politics, of having no power, of being a kind of like independent discipline that has nothing to do with other disciplines, right? So what I realized through my work, through the research that I have been conducting since I was a PhD student at MIT, is that we really need to start looking at architecture from other disciplines, from everywhere. I mean, from fungi, from infections, from concrete, from everywhere, right? And by doing that, we can really be able to have a more complete understanding of our own discipline. And how we can, why this is a story, why this history is still important for us today. This is painful, and it's painful because, you know, like first, all this kind of like very blatant racism that we see today made my work even more painful than it was when I was doing my research, right? Right now, the pandemic that brings all these reflections about care made all this even more painful, right? Because they were because the good things that we can rescue from this history are also impregnated by too much of this ideology, right? So how we can actually treat all these things in all the grades, right, that are between the white and the black. So what I wanted to say in terms of what you were saying about building institutions and the feminist discourse, today I was referring more about about the biopolitics because I didn't have the time to deal with this, but the instrumentalization of gender through puericulture. So puericulture, because in this kind of transnational connection between France and Latin America that basically was at the center of everything at the beginning of the 20th century in Latin America, puericulture was a sort of a form of eugenics. So it was a vehicle for the implementation of eugenics. And it was that an analog of agriculture, but for the cultivation of this unit, the modern child unit. And that put women as at the center, at the target of the entities that must be controlled, that has to be controlled, that requires control. So that together, so that makes us to think about race and gender as historian of I'm going everywhere. So like I'm going to finish with this and allow other people to talk because I can be talking about this forever. But a historian of medicine, Nancy Stepan, mentioned this, that somebody else said this, but I don't remember right now off the top of my head, that gender and race were artifactual because they were conceived as like objective entities rather than social constructs, right? And in that way, we all fell in that trap. And I think that we are still dealing with this kind of discourses, even though we are in the 21st century, dealing with all these different advances in science and believing that we are in a completely different stage. Well, I think that I should stop.
It makes me think, just to jump in, if that's okay, the question about institutionality that Gia, you posed, and I think that something that the F architecture group kind of brought to the fore, the kind of limits of empathy, can also apply to the kind of institutional context, where all of a sudden the sort of the empathy boundary for institutions, where I've been working with the architecture lobby for a while and trying to understand how you have access to information and conversation and dialogue and like the individual versus the kind of institutional group. I think it's like one of the major issues that we have to deal with today, and it's become much more present with the kind of virtual discourse that we are experiencing. But it's interesting because I feel like we always like draw that wall, that sort of atmospheric wall, that boundary, once the institution becomes present or has any kind of control. And so I think that, it's been really interesting hearing all of these different presentations from that angle and that provocation, Gia, that you brought out at the very beginning. So I appreciated that and wanted to mention it.
Thanks, DJ and Fabiola. This is a question for Gia from Gray, who asks, your mention of Audre Lorde leading into the function of architectural practice has me thinking about her quote that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Would you view care as a tool with which to dismantle the master's house? If so, how can it do so in opposition to the master's tools of transaction, hierarchy, etc.? If not, why not?
I think that the ways in which ethics of care thinks about reproductive labors. And let me think of it. Like, I don't know if like I would want to instrumentalize care that way, but I think that what we're always kind of trying to do is identify when we've fallen into a productivist logic, because institutions that we encounter in our daily life, often we see them as authoritative bodies, kind of like gender and race, that exist a priori, right? And so I think one thing that is really brilliant about perspectives of care is that it's constantly always reminding us that actually this context and environment in which we exist in has its own biases, and therefore can be intervened in and can be reconstructed. So, you know, and what it took was really like a shift in not thinking about, you know, a huge part of ethics of care came from this study that was conducted in Harvard that tried to identify a kind of psychology of morality. And essentially, you know, of course, the guy that conducted the study said, boys have a stronger sense of morality. And then a woman came in and said, no, you just weren't able to see the kinds of perspectives that these young girls in your study were offering, because they weren't operating on a perspective of rights, inalienable rights, which has been like the basis of moral philosophy, but they've been operating off a perspective of responsibility and care, right? So trying to think about like what feels inalienable and what feels like, and trying to identify what is being constructed in a system, and then identifying mechanisms of deconstruction. I think that has been a huge part of what care offers me anyway. But so I think Audre Lorde was saying something similarly when she was saying you can't always use the same tools of structure, patriarchy, power. You know, I will point to the AIA women in architecture's use of the word power as an aspiration. And so it seems worthwhile to ask, like, why is the term power the language we want to use? And are those still the master's tools, right?
It kind of also brings up some of the things that we were discussing in the previous panel about kind of an aspect or reciprocity of care is also ideas of fragility, failure, rupture. And so it was interesting, the idea that structures of care, solidarity networks rise up the moment these sort of institutions, right, become dismantled or sort of reveal their own meagerness, right? And so that's where the moment of care, the moment of solidarity actually kind of comes into play. It's not always about the kind of instrumentalized, like what you said, Gia, it's not just about instrumentalizing care or the kind of the sort of literal act of dismantling, but understanding the sort of the inherent fragilities and vulnerabilities in these institutions and finding sort of maybe ways around that or outside of that.
I'm really interested in this kind of discussion around the institution and institutional forms, and specifically what you brought up, Gia, in your use of the banal bureaucratic measures of making the kind of organizational processes visible, making labor visible, and how you see that as different from instrumentalizing care. Like, how is your sort of use of the bureaucratic form a form of instrumentalization that opens its way to caring? Or is this a kind of perversion of bureaucracy? I think we're always interested in like not only trying to operate within the institution, but push up against it. Because I think often we forget that institutions like universities and museums are employers, and they are the ones that are propagating this kind of precarity that we face as workers in those institutions. But yeah, I really appreciate your perspective, and I would love to hear more from you on that.
Yeah, I think the idea that you would look at like paper documents and not just paper, like obviously they're now on my screen, but that you would look at what are basically artifacts of bureaucracy, but through the lens of like media studies, and then try to like enact media studies in your life, is you know, just a way of trying to make sure that we're always recognizing that even though we inevitably have to work in managerial systems like an institution where there's a system and you have payroll and you have taxes and you have the 990 and you have all this stuff and a budget and a timeline, that these sites of production can also be very meaningful if you can think about them meaningfully. So if you can find ways in which you're writing a budget and that budget has a narrative and there's a reason why, it's not just like who's getting paid, because even though that's really important, it's also like, I'll just use an example that I'm also having, now I have to write about this, but an example would be like in a nonprofit organization, we obviously receive a lot of free labor, right? So when I used to run a small arts organization, you would get a ton of like architects doing a ton of work on their own, and you would never have to pay them. I mean, you have to pay them, but you wouldn't pay them nearly equivalent to the work they were doing, as I'm sure F architecture is also experiencing. So one thing that was really interesting when I was thinking through like the accounting of a nonprofit was that I learned that there are, of course, ways of acknowledging in-kind services, but that the forms of acknowledgement that were permissible to an architect were not permissible to an artist. So in a nonprofit, you can say, this architect built an installation and that was $10,000 of labor. But you can't say this artist built an installation and that's $10,000 of in-kind labor, because an architect is a professional service. So a lawyer, a doctor, all of these individuals who are professionally recognized and trained can be acknowledged in the financial statements of a nonprofit as in-kind service. That's sort of mandated by the IRS, but an artist couldn't. So you already have in these like systems divisions of labor and identifications and definitions of labor that can or cannot be recognized. But what's really important in that recognition is that it feeds into the true organizational value of the organization, right? So an example would be, is my organization actually worth $100,000 because an architect has actually done $50,000 of in-kind labor? Or is it worth $50,000 because an artist has done in-kind labor? And that adds on, right? Because then all of your budgets that you're producing for certain kinds of funding, like grant funding or foundation funding, they look at the value of your organization to determine what percentage of funding you're getting from them. So maybe they give you 10% of it. So it all just is like adds up, right? And it comes down to like, are you putting down in your budget line the cost of labor that's given to you in your organization? And so just like using that as an example, these spaces of administration, like they become really automated, but actually you can really use them and think about them as a place where you can organize agendas or politicize purpose or, whatever, and I've just found that to be really interesting in all the work I've had to learn how to do in the organizations I've run, because obviously I didn't train to be a nonprofit director, I trained to be an architect. And it's interesting to think about like, yeah, how you like control those mechanisms in different ways.
Thank you for those answers and questions. This is a question from Amelin, who asks, firstly, she thanks everyone for a fantastic set of presentations. And she's asking what the relationship is between care and control, between support and management. What thresholds of non-hierarchical care can the designer, typically a figure in power or control, operate in today?
I think in our practice, we really attempt concertedly to cede control. And I think that comes from like a refusal of the kind of like absolute knowledge of the architect, that we're suddenly turning our attention to some issue and we have something remarkable to say about it. I think doing research requires a lot of giving up of yourself and your expertise. But I think on the same note, like we're always doing this sort of dance where we're trying to like assert our value in a particular situation, and which like maybe doesn't recognize the work that we do as valuable. Maybe Virginia and Rosana can chime in. This is like an ongoing discussion that we have over and over with every project. But I think that it also plays out, as we said in our presentation, interpersonally. It's like letting somebody else speak. And I think that makes your sort of dynamic stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of an architect asserting control, the ways that they do that are by creating this kind of expansive vision that everyone can notch into in a kind of predetermined way. And so I think trying to understand modes of organization that can exist prior to the creation of those documents is really important, which is why I do really appreciate the presentation that Gia made. And I think that working with unpacking was like such a difficult challenge for me because I didn't really even understand the ways that I was trained to do the things I was doing. And working with anthropologists was a really good way, and these particular anthropologists was a really good way for me to see the ways that when you don't have a project in mind, you become so much more open to hearing the things that people need because they're not always architectural. Obviously, they rarely are. So I think it's nice to see the slowness of that process and to start to think about the fact that maybe you're not even needed. And I think when you consider that as a first position, you can actually become much more open to different modes of operation.
I think operating outside of institutional support most of the time can allow one to operate more easily in a non-hierarchical way. I feel like, you know, the designer as a figure of power or control, as the question posed, like I find it as a very rare occasion because usually you're already operating within this hierarchy where you're answering to some kind of power and you have to model, you know, the project around it. But at least for F architectures, because we operate in a way where we have the project and then we're like shopping for finance, like someone to finance us or not, you know, depending. It had allowed us to really experiment more in ways of working with each other and with other people in ways that can be more mutually productive and are really embedded in this kind of care for one another. So I do think also, yeah, like having that institution kind of be at the top usually would make a bit of difference, but maybe not when you already have the project done. I don't know. We're still kind of learning how to operate through it, but I just wanted to answer to the power question.
Maybe I'm really curious what you said, Rosana, about by not working in institutions, it's maybe easier to work non-hierarchically. Because, you know, it's interesting, Gio, when you're talking about the kind of activist formatting, activist spreadsheeting, activist letter writing as a way of appropriating bureaucratic processes and formats to kind of take power, sort of disturb power, trouble power. But does it, but I think what Rosana's point was really smart, because like there's also other sort of forms of kind of grabbing power or kind of speaking to power outside of those institutions, right? And so I'm really interested in formatting, not just in terms of like the architecture's vision as a type of format, but also the kind of bureaucratic tendencies as a type of format. Because I think I do think that like design can offer a space outside of kind of bureaucratic control in the same way that formatting or spreadsheeting can, right? And so, you know, I want to believe that. And maybe this is kind of my original question to Fabiola, that of course these institutions have ideology and they're operative in that way, but design I think can have multiple, have much more of like kind of a duplicitous nature where it can maybe belong to many ideologies at once, or can be both institutional but outside an institutional power. And so I think, so I don't know if this is a question or response, but I think it's also interesting to think the two issues aren't so sort of binary, but of institution or not institution, but kind of thinking through different formats as a kind of way to get power, I think could be kind of an interesting provocation.
Yeah, I think I just can never think of us ever being outside of institutions. I mean, it would be like saying art is outside an economy, right? In that there's always some kind of pressure applied. So whether, I mean, I don't mean only art institutions. I am thinking, you know, on architecture specifically, like to be someone wrote somewhere in a thing like, what was it? Can you be a designer? I forget what it is, but my answer was like, how can you be a designer without ever having to confront the structures of finance that govern who cannot build and who's hiring to build? So I think out of like a totally demoralized experience, out of like finishing a architecture degree to some extent, I think at some point I realized like I probably will never be able to practice the way I would like unless there's some other form of institution that allows financing to happen. And so now I'm just really interested now in like financial institutions. How can you redesign those? So I think I've just gone so far at this point, trying to like change the conditions in which I have to operate, that I'm just now in these other systems. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe those can be changed.
Totally, yeah.
Right? Because otherwise, I mean, what's our option now? Like for students who are graduating after us, like what are their options? Like severe tuition, you know, severe debt and corporate practice and like who gets to build anymore? I don't know. It's like seems impossible unless you go on an academic track or self-sustained through cultural work, which it, again has its own economy of logic, right? So I don't know. Sorry, I don't mean to be pessimist. I know those students out there, you'll be fine.
Thank you for that insight.
Fabiola.
Oh, go ahead, DJ.
No, I thought Fabiola was about to speak, I think.
No, I just wanted to say something talking about institutions and in the way that, you know, after listening to what Gabriela, Virginia, and Brittany and what you were saying, Gia, I never know if I'm pronouncing right your name, right? Yeah. We're saying there are these two words that seems like they are in different places, like institutions and vulnerability. That in my view is there where there is a key, right? Like for instance, I'm absolutely with you, Gia. We cannot be out of institutions, and we can call institutions either the ideology that is basically like bringing us together or apart, or the institutions themselves that we can see, for instance, in the case of the research that I shared with you today, the Museo Social in Paris and the Museo Social in Argentina, right? Like if you want to do a serious historical research, look for the institutions and see what are the different actors and protagonists that these institutions brings together. And for me, the Museo Social was the beginning of everything, because that's where I saw the complicity between physicians and architects, and that was the beginning of everything, right? But in the same way, I feel that when you were inviting us to rethink the institutions that are around us, as you said at the beginning of this afternoon, Gia, I think that that's a very, very, very important invitation. And we really all need to do that. I think that part of our duty, as important, I mean, as a scholar for me, as important as teaching and doing my research, that are both extremely important to me, is building the institution where I work, right? And one thing that I'm doing right now, and that is basically taking a lot of my time and a lot of my passion and a lot of what and a lot of the love that I feel for what I do, is a research collective that I put together that we call the Racial Geography Project, that is basically seeking to rectify the lack of discussion about race and racism at Rice, and to offer a decolonized reading of the Rice University campus. So what we are trying to do is to unveil the racist landscape of this university campus. So its buildings, its monuments, the unveiling in a way the histories of racism and violence that are registered in the buildings, in the materials, in the monuments. And by doing that, one thing that was really surprising to me was to discover that the face of Galton, Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, is in our academic quad, right? So suddenly, I had been here for 10 years. This is my 10th year here at Rice University. It took me 10 years to realize that eugenics was one of the 3 applied science that were fundamental for the curriculum in which this university was created. It is in the inaugural speech for the creation of the institution. Of course, it was an institution that was created only for white people. So one important thing for me right now is to do this history that some people will criticize me for making vulnerable the institution, right? Because some people will say, no need, that's the past, we don't need to deal with that. We need to deal with these kind of discourses in order to make the institution better. We want an institution that is more inclusive, that is better for everyone. So we really need to go through all these different processes. In the same way as Virginia was commenting, how difficult it was for you to get into a completely different territory, working with anthropologists in Ecuador, with the indigenous community, not really knowing what language you were speaking, right? And in the same way, like really like dealing with whoever you have to deal with, like the board of trustees, the former students who are not happy about this, anyone. We really need to find a common language and a way of dealing with this difficult work that will make us better and our institution with us better. Anyway, this is just a kind of like round, but I think that these things bring us bring these two discourses together in a way that I think that has to do with care. I think that we really need to be. And I love your story, Gabriela, about you taking care of your mom. I mean, it really touched my heart. We really need to share more of those kind of things.
So I think we have time for one more question, not to sort of mess up this flow, but I think there's actually a perfect question lined up from Harish, if you want to read it out loud, Kayla, that's maybe a direct outcome of this discussion.
Yeah, thinking about existing institutions and institutions. Open to everyone, are you optimistic about the direction that institutions, design firms, and organizations are moving towards, whether in opening up conversations about personal care or in their treatment and transparency of labor? These systems of production often feel immovable and, as Fabiola has shown, deeply rooted in their histories, making it hard to see noticeable change. So it's a direction moving forward.
I think we have to be optimistic, otherwise we might, at some level, in some capacity, pessimistic in others. Is the Gramsci quote that Anna Maria Leone used last year. What was it? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But I think that the discussion about the kind of transparency or of the institution, or the way that we can become more intimate with these different scales of both the collective or the institution or with ourselves, it does require an amount of labor that I think, or a direction and focus of that labor that's not what we're used to. And I think we're in a moment of reacclimating to those kinds of processes. And so, yeah, it might take looking very carefully and sharing very publicly a large amount of bureaucratic spreadsheet-based information, for example, but we have to learn how to kind of, I don't know, deal with it in a way that can be discussed and debated. And we need modes of doing that, which I think is kind of exciting, kind of boring exciting in a good way, but it's really powerful, because I think all of a sudden we now have the capacities to start to shape the boundaries and edges and kind of the edges of the institutions that we're part of. So I think that, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to think about our institutions aren't just sort of homogenous, or like it's not just, so sitting here, it's not just rice, right? It's actually a whole different sort of set of communities, ecologies, and kinships, intimacies, right? Like the kind of the institution, there are many types of institutions, even with F architecture, when you guys presented yourself as this kind of, your sort of work and ethos was based on this sort of you as a triumvirate, right? That's an institution, right? The threeness of your practice, I thought was really interesting, right? Like, and I think that, I mean, as we sort of are able to kind of stitch together these sort of different kinship structures, I think as we're sort of able to participate in boundary commoning and other types of kind of commingling between groups, to answer Harish's question, it's not just the university you're at, but the School of Architecture, the different groups you're in, the different classes you're in, the kind of different networks that you produce. I think that the kind of laying bare of acts of care, of maintenance, of stewardship, of these kind of custodial ethics, I think I think that it's happening now, especially in the last kind of year. And I think that that has to, like, these institutions also don't change overnight. They don't change in a month, right? Like, they take a while to kind of unmake or remake. And so I think that that's also kind of interesting, is that as we talk about care and its relationship to fragility, there's an idea of an ethics of kind of remaking with a broken world. And I think that that's also kind of an important aspect of the sort of the ethics of this, of these conversations and the optimism of these conversations.
I think, I don't know if I'm like optimistic, but I do think, like, I like to tell students, I like to remind students in my classes that when we're sitting together and we're a really heterogeneous group of people from different backgrounds, social classes, and experiences, that like 200 years ago, that was not a possibility. And that somebody had the idea that we would have free public education. And today this is now part of our reality, right? So I think that people have to be really patient about the kind of change that they want to envision, because it's definitely not going to happen in a year, but that they should be thinking about like really long span changes. Like just what are you doing now that might resonate in 100 years, not in like scale, but in like just thinking about like what would happen, right? I think that's the historian in me being trained. And then I also think like the principles of mutual aid that we were, I sort of was talking about with Dean Spade's book, but that so many different activists and organizers are leaning into, is like, you have to model alternatives. So I think that yes, institutions exist, and you guys we're all in a very big institution right now, but you have to find ways in which you can model alternatives, whether that's like a really small working group of friends that are just thinking through like what's possible, or whether as you like progress in your life, you have the actual capacity and authority and resources to build alternatives for other people. That seems like, so it's not like one answer, but I just think students net today, like that's you guys are probably the generation that are going to have to make the biggest change in architecture, because there's such an insane inertia in the generations before us, like insane. I don't even know where to go, So yeah.
Thank you all so much. We're definitely out of time. I just wanted to thank everyone for the kind of incredible, the things that everyone shared, and the presentations, the work, and also the personal stories. I think it really is part of the spirit of the symposium. And so I would just like to give a kind of a virtual round of applause to everyone. Thank you all for joining. Really incredible to see the work and have this conversation. I also just wanted to, the participants and also the panelists, the symposium is concluding tomorrow evening with a closing keynote lecture with Silvia Federici. And so I'd encourage you all to join in and perhaps follow up on these conversations tomorrow. With that, thank you everyone. I really enjoyed it, and yeah. Hopefully we can continue these conversations not on Zoom in the near future.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.